Well, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all our online viewers, wherever you may be. My name is Russell Shao. I am the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a biweekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, featuring timely analysis and informed opinions, regular public seminars, an annual symposium in the fall, scholarship opportunities, podcasts, and more. If you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, you may do so by visiting our website at globaltaiwan.org. Before we begin today's program, I also want to thank our co-founders, directors, advisors, staff, and interns who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. I am extremely delighted to host today's conversation with Elbridge Colby for his book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Bridge is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. Previously, he was the director of the defense program of the Center for New American Security. And before that, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. He was the lead official in the development and rollout of the Defense Department's 2018 National Defense Strategy. Now, Bridge has been on a whirlwind book tour since the release of his book in September 2021, and we are truly grateful that he has chosen GTI and our audience to share his thoughts about Taiwan and how it fits into this strategy of denial. Now, obviously, we're not giving away the cake here, and we'll leave the golden nuggets for all of you to mine from purchasing and reading Bridge's thoughtful and meticulous analysis. I want to note that we do want to hear from our live audience members. So we will reserve around 15 minutes at the end of today's session to take your questions. You may submit your questions by sending them to contact@globaltaiwan.org or tweet us at Global Taiwan or use the chat function on our YouTube page. Please be sure to leave us with your name as well as affiliation, and we'll prioritize those questions in our audience Q&A. So, Bridge, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks. Great to be with you, Russell. Thanks for the kind introduction. Great to be with GTI, which is such an important institution. So delighted to be here to talk about the book with you.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for those kind words. I like to open these conversations up in a much more general format and give you a chance to talk about what motivated you to write this book and why you wrote it and why you think the United States needs a strategy of denial.
Sure. Well, I mean, a real sense of urgency and I would say foreboding, which is, rooted in the fact of China's rise and the enormous kind of tectonic consequences that entails for us as Americans. I look at it through an American prism, but I think it's a sort of enlightened self-interest view, and I think relevant to a lot of other countries, certainly Taiwan. And frankly, the sort of most pointed end of my fear is that we are neglecting focusing enough on China's rise, and particularly its military element, and particularly the threat to Taiwan, and that we are on track to have a war over Taiwan, which at a minimum would be probably would be immensely destructive, even if it turned out reasonably well, or could be so bad that it wouldn't be that destructive, but would result in an outright defeat. And I don't see the degree of urgency and focus that I think this just truly monumental challenge presents. And so I wrote the book to try to actually, I think as we've discussed before, Russell, I'm certainly fond of Taiwan. I've been there a couple of times, but I'm not a Taiwanophile per se. It's not like I grew up in Taiwan or something like that. I'm looking at this through an American perspective, and I try to lay out sort of logically and deductively in a framework how we need to focus when we are no longer as dominant as we once were in the world. I mean, after the Cold War, we were the only superpower. Now we're not, and we're basically still acting like we're the only superpower. And that's a recipe for disaster. And so, where I work out the logic is that, we need to sustain an anti-hegemonic coalition in Asia, lead and sustain, to deny China's ambitions to dominate Asia, the world's largest market. And Taiwan is critical to that because it's connected to our credibility, which is important in this context. It's militarily significant along the first island chain. The alternatives are worse. So that leads me to think that we should defend Taiwan through a military strategy of denial. But the critical point there, Russell, is that our interest in defending Taiwan, I usually kind of refer to it as sort of a 70-30 interest, because it's, we're talking about a lot of Americans being killed, potentially, God forbid. I mean, my whole purpose here is to avoid that. But, we need to bring down to a tolerable level the cost and risk involved in defending Taiwan. And that means we need to focus. It means the Japanese need to do more, and it means the Taiwanese need to do a lot more. And if all those things don't come together, we could get to a situation where we'll just be defeated outright, or where the costs and risks would be too high, and we'll have to adapt, which I don't want to have happen. But that's another risk. So I'm really trying, with the book, but also in my public engagement now, I'm really trying to drive a sense of urgency and focus on this.
Yeah, Bridget, that's that's a fantastic opener here, and I want to pull on a few threads that you laid out there. And I think on the urgency and immediacy factor, I think part of that relates to also the importance of defining America's core interest in the world. And I think you've outlined some of what you thought are the key U.S. interests in Taiwan. But I was wondering if you could sort of flesh that out a little bit in terms of putting that into a larger context, but also where you see Taiwan fit into that.
Yeah. Well, unlike most American foreign policy, national security types, I don't have an ideological kind of, it's our job to police the world or spread democracy. I wish for stability and free governments in other parts of the world, but I don't think it's the job of the American people to be, the Pax Americana kind of thing. The job of American foreign policy, in my view, is to serve Americans' security, direct physical security, our freedom, and our Republican system of government, obviously, and our prosperity. Now, I don't look at that in a zero-sum way. I say, all right, that doesn't mean that we need to hurt other people. To the contrary, but I try to root it in that concept. And if I think about our foreign policy on that basis, well, then I say, well, what's the biggest threat out there to it? I mean, and there's terrorism, obviously, but terrorists are by definition pretty weak. We've kind of figured out how to do it. There's always a possibility of something bad happening, but it's not going to undermine, if we don't let it, it's not going to undermine the sort of systemic foundations. North Korea is a nasty government. Cuba doesn't like us, but they're too weak. They don't, we can, if we want to, we can always deal with those problems, basically. The most significant challenge to our interest then, because it's very unlikely that a country would actually want to invade us for, we have a nuclear arsenal, we're behind two oceans, etc. More seriously is that another country would become so powerful in the international system that it could marshal its economic power and other forms of power to basically coerce us in our national life. Basically, have us, I mean, to use the phrase, some kind of a kowtow to some other, and during the Cold War, that would have been the Soviet Union basically, establishing a dominant position in Europe, which was then the world's, critical economic area. Well, that's changed. Now, Asia is by far the most important area in the world, and it's becoming more so. I mean, if you look at the famous McKinsey map, it's quite interesting. If you look at the economic center of the world, in 1400, it was in Asia. It moved over the North Atlantic over the following 500 years. Now it's moving back very quickly. So Asia is going to be 50 or more % of global GDP. So the way I think about it, we're all going to be working for the Asian market. And by far the most powerful entity in the international system other than ourselves is China, which is in Asia, obviously. So by deduction, the most significant challenge to our interests is China establishing a dominant position over Asia, which they clearly want to do. The PRC continues to be ahead of my ability to come up with examples of what. So I just need to look at the newspaper every day. So that's our interest. Then the question becomes how, right? We can't do it by ourselves because we're not powerful enough. We're too far, and also we're not. It's not like the stakes in Asia, and this is a critical point. They're very important for us, but they're not existential, right? I mean, Imelda Marcos once said that they used to call the East Asia Bureau in the State Department the Far East Bureau, and Imelda Marcos's comment was far from what, and it was like, well, it's far from America, so it's not far from the Philippines, but it does sort of get at something, and I think so there's this, and I think you've read the book, so I really try to grapple with this kind of balancing act where it's really, really, really important, but it's not existential. So we need to have a strategy that works with that reality all the way down. And so basically, long story short, we need a coalition, right? It's pretty standard behavior, okay? Work with other countries that also don't want to live under the Chinese thumb, Japan, India, etc. The problem is how to keep that coalition going, because China's, and this is a critical part of the way I think about it, is, we shouldn't prepare for China to do whatever. We should be thinking about what their best strategy is, because that's the most dangerous in practical terms. And the best strategy,
right, Bridge, and I think that leads, I think, to a great segue to understanding,
sure.
Exactly what that best strategy is, right? And I think just some context there. I think you articulated it brilliantly, which is, I think a lot of the conversations now has focused on really drawing very sort of long conclusions, but not really focused on the logic of that strategic conclusions that you've I think outlined in your book, and and you focus just as much about the logic of what an effective American defense strategy is, but also you focus in terms of the logic of China's strategy, right? And then that's where it goes into this, why you focus on China's best strategy. And so perhaps to frame that a bit in terms of how you can discuss this, can you discuss this distinction between what you've outlined between the conquest versus punishment and a complete within the sort of the best defense strategy that you have?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is very relevant to Taiwan. I mean, I think that their best strategy overall is what I call focused and sequential strategy. And that's basically the idea that you want to have China's best strategy is to collapse this coalition without paying the bill of fighting everybody at the same time. Hitler was trying to fight the coalition arrayed against him, but he fought a total war and he alienated everybody, right? Which led to disaster, obviously, for Germany and everybody else. But China doesn't want to do that. And I mean, I don't think they're likely to. Certainly wouldn't be wise of them. Instead, if they can achieve what I think of as like systemic effects, like if they can attain their regional dominance with smaller steps, and these things do happen. And the example I point to, and there are probably examples in Chinese history, for instance, which I'm embarrassed to say I don't know well enough, at least the earlier stages of Chinese history, but like the wars of German unification, where Prussia was able to fight 3 small wars over the course of 7 years and achieve something that had been a fixed aspect of European balance of power, was no unified Germany. And they achieved it through wars that were relatively modest in size and significance by European standards. So I think this is what I'm really worried about. And that means that Chinese will go after the parts of the coalition that are vulnerable, but also somewhat paradoxically are tied to Washington. And this is where Taiwan becomes so important, because what you can see after, for instance, 2014 is the best thing that ever happened in NATO was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because it showed that the American security commitment was actually valuable, right? So if China puts the heat on Thailand or Vietnam, well, Thailand is kind of a fuzzy case, but Vietnam, that's going to suggest that they are intimidated by the Americans. It's going to drive people towards the Americans, and the Chinese don't want that. Rather, they want to undermine the central thing. This is why our credibility here is so important. The central thing is the confidence in the Americans, and our ability and resolve to essentially effectively defend our partners. And in here, to get to your question, Russell, the Chinese can use economic and soft power things, but I think the reality is they're not going to get countries, certainly not Taiwan, to give up. Well, in fact, if they can't get Taiwan, they're hopeless everywhere else. They're not going to get countries to give up through kind of trickery or persuasion. I mean, China's become incredibly unpopular in the last few years under Xi Jinping. In Taiwan, you've had obviously the resounding re-election of Tsai Ing-wen, and I think even the Kuomintang is not. I mean, what person believes in one country, two systems now? I mean, I'd literally like to, I literally like to, I don't know, place a bet with that person because I'd make a lot of money. You know what I mean? or play mahjong or something. I don't know, whatever. But it's like it's not a wise thing, right? So that's good because it makes me more sanguine about a lot of the soft power stuff and the disinformation or whatever. But it makes me more worried about the military piece. And this gets to your point. And I think that China's real, and this is where I really try to think it through from Red's perspective. Red is how the Americans refer to, the enemy in the war games or whatever. If I thought about it from the other guy's perspective, if I know that soft power doesn't work and economic sanctions aren't going to get me far enough, which you can see with Australia right now, then I'm going to look to the military instrument because I care a lot about Taiwan, obviously, for a variety, both geopolitical and irredentist reasons. I'm going to use military force. Okay, so I'm going to cross the Rubicon, right? I'm going to start a war over Taiwan if I'm China. Then how do I do it? There's often, they're going to seize the Kimoen Matsu or the Pratas or something and test it out. Well, I think the reason that the offshore islands are still in Taiwan's hands is because China has recognized that it would backfire to take them. Obviously, China could have taken them at any point, in a sense, basically. But I think they haven't because they realized it would backfire. But the basic logic here, Russell, is Napoleon said, if you want to take Vienna, famously, he said, if you want to take Vienna, take Vienna. If you want something, you go for it. And if you're going to go for it, you do it right. You generate surprise, and then you seize it and you invade. And the critical thing that does here with the fait accompli is it does a couple things. One, it creates a new set of facts that the Americans have to deal with. And it's much harder to kick somebody out of an entrenched position than to defend. And the second thing is it removes the Taiwanese as a variable, which if I'm in Beijing, I don't want to have to convince the people of Taiwan to give up. I want to force them to give up, because if you do a blockade or bombing campaign or some combination, you're basically trying to persuade the people on Taiwan to do that. It's possible they give up. I don't think so. I certainly wouldn't if I were Taiwanese, or wouldn't want to. But I think that's an important point, and that means a couple things. It means invasion is the most serious thing to prepare for, and it means we'll probably have little warning because it's dumb to give warning. Surprise is helpful, and the nature of the surprise could be very we might actually be able to see it but not accurately perceive what's happening. For instance, this is what happened in 1973 with the Egyptians and the Israelis. But anyway, that's why we really, and that leads to my denial. Denial is about the Americans and the Taiwanese critically together bringing that cost and risk down and denying China's theory of victory, which is ultimately the invasion. Also the blockade. There are things that Taiwan needs to do on the blockade too, storing goods and so forth, and food and medicine, et cetera. But energy. But I think that's the basic idea here.
Bridge, I want to ask you to take a step back a little bit, and I think you and really outline what you think. What are the elements of an effective defense there? I mean, I think you've outlined where you think Taiwan fits in terms of U.S. interest and in this coalition and the threats and challenges. But perhaps for our audience members to just give some context here in terms of what is the effective defense that you are trying to articulate in your work.
This is a great question. It's particularly important for us to talk about it in the U.S.-Taiwan context, because in effective defense, you put your finger on it in a very sophisticated way, if I may say, Russell. Effective defense is a critical concept because a defense is a relative idea. It's somewhat subjective. If you say you're going to defend somebody, it could mean you're not going to let anybody else touch them, or it could mean you're not going to let them get beaten up, but you can't stop a dead arm. I don't know what you call it in Taiwan, but the hitting on the arm, right? an effective defense in this context is a defense that is sufficient to keep Taiwan resisting. So it's a little bit, it's not circular, but it's a political standard, right? At the end of the day, it's whatever Taiwan needs to, not give in to China and not disaffiliate from the American and coalition and shift over to Beijing's side, whatever Beijing's particular, but the core strategic logic is shifting into Beijing's camp. And what I will say about this is, of course, from a Taiwanese perspective, you'd say, well, I'd love to be perfectly defended. That would be great, right? I mean, we don't, I'd love to have a perfect defense. Kind of, not really, actually, because the higher the standard of defense, the more difficult it is for the Americans to do it, the more likely it is it will be too much and will force us to draw the line farther back. So actually, from Taiwan's perspective, the lower your standard is, the better it is for you. So, I mean, the example I'd like to give is Great Britain in 1940, which, in a sense, the famous comment of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who ran the Battle of Britain for the Royal Air Force. He said, "My job was not to win the war. My job was to stop the invasion." Now, remember that the Germans were conducting the Blitz. Later in the war, they had the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Obviously, there was a submarine attempt to blockade the islands of Great Britain, the strangulation campaign, but Britain held on. But if Britain had been in a situation where it said any attacks on the British homeland mean we're going to surrender, well, then the war would have been over, right? America would not have been able, and that's a whole history. But my point here is the tougher and more resilient Taiwan is, and look, I live in Washington, D.C. It's easy for me to say, but I'm trying to lay this out in a logical and realistic framework. The more resilient Taiwan is, the more it can take, the more likely it is to be relieved and to be defended, because the higher that standard is, the more likely it's going to break, right? And then the U.S. is going to have to draw the line behind it. So I think this is critical. And together, what we want to do is obviously provide for defense, shooting down missiles to the extent they can. It's very difficult, but also resilience, air raid shelters, stockpiling food and medicine and munitions and energy, etc., because that will make it easier. It will make it less difficult for the Americans to help, which will make it more likely that we do. So it's kind of a virtuous cycle.
Well, I mean, to drill in here, talk to us about the element of resolve in an effective defense strategy.
Well, resolve is critical, and I would say that the kind of you're asking all the best questions. Resolve is critical, but resolve and strength are interrelated. And this is, I think, one of the things I really tried to reintroduce into American defense thinking in a way that I think people have lost in the last generation since the Cold War, right? So, the higher your resolve, you can cut this in a number of different ways, but if you think that the higher your resolve, the less force you need. Just to give an example, right? I mean, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong were able to defeat the United States, even though we were much stronger, because they had much higher resolve over the issue at stake. I mean, we could have destroyed North Vietnam, but our resolve wasn't high enough given the stakes, right? Vice versa also holds true. The stronger you are, the less you need resolve. So America could kind of take down Saddam Hussein over here, unwisely in my view, but most people didn't really care that much, but the threats were so little to most Americans. The other thing that I will say about resolve is that how a war plays out will itself affect resolve. So one thing I always, and actually when I participate in war games, I say this, and I think this is really important for Taiwan to understand. A war is a story, in a sense. I mean, I'm not trying to be flippant, but a war is a narrative, right? It's a series of events that lead to other events, right? That obviously could have gone another way. And this is really important because the way a war pans out affects resolve, which in turn affects the level of force and power that a country is willing to allocate. Let's be concrete. My favorite example is Japan, 1941. Now, most Americans had zero interest in fighting a war in the Pacific. Again, which were important interests, but not existential for America. I mean, it was even much less important back then even. However, Japan, for military operational reasons, and they had a kind of a sort of a strategy overall, they decided to attack, obviously Pearl Harbor, but also the Philippines, Wake, Guam, and the Japanese forces behaved in an incredibly brutal way. And that catalyzed a resolve on the part of the American people that wasn't there before. That actually not only to fight a war, but to fight a war to the end. I mean, that we literally burned down most of Japan's urban infrastructure. If Japan had fought the war differently, I mean, if I were in Tokyo in 1941, I would have said, let's leave the Americans alone and go after the European colonial possessions. Then Franklin Roosevelt's going to have to say to the American people, oh, let's go defend Europe's colonial possessions in Asia, which nobody would have been for. I mean, it might have been a war, but it would have been much more likely to end in a negotiated peace that Japan could have lived with. Or the other example I like to use here is Abraham Lincoln, our president during the Civil War. He deliberately got the Southern Confederates to fire the first shot on Fort Sumter, which immediately led to a huge surge in volunteers in the northern states to man the army. So what does this mean for Taiwan? It means the stronger and more resolute Taiwan is, the more it forces China to act in a way that not only hurts Taiwanese, but also forces them to attack Americans and Japanese, the more likely people are to come to Taiwan's defense and to fight harder. Mm-hmm. If Taiwan is fragile, and China has to fight just a narrow conflict that can be described as limited and localized, it's much less likely that others will come to Taiwan's defense. So this is a critical point in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, Bridge, I want to focus a bit on this one, and in some ways challenge you a little bit in terms of the approach that you have taken in addressing, the matter of, resiliency. And I know that you're singular focused on the military and defense side, but there is, the other aspect of resiliency is also psychological resiliency, and that also matters in resolve, and it's not a function simply of just what military hardware Taiwan has, or the United States can provide, Taiwan, or it can obtain or develop indigenously. But I mean, China is, I think, engaging in I think unrestricted warfare in many of its activities, not only against to Taiwan, but broadly. How does that factor into your analysis of the challenges that Taiwan faces, and in your efforts to try to effectively enhance Taiwan's resolve in a more comprehensive manner, address this problem? I mean, it could be that you think that this is just not a serious enough issue to have to address, but I wonder if you can sort of talk about that a little bit, how that sort of factors into your analysis.
No, I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it is a common, I shouldn't say common, I would say a pretty widely held view that the non-military, I mean, Diamond Liu is just sending me something on Twitter to this effect, I think. I just don't think that's that serious of a threat. I mean, I don't know. I'm looking at it through an American's eyes, so caveat emptor, but it doesn't look to me like the people on Taiwan are going to give up based on anything other than, as Chairman Mao put it, the barrel of a gun. So what I would worry about is the resolve of the people on Taiwan to allocate enough resources to Taiwan's defense, and to allocate them to the defense equipment and steps that are appropriate for the situation. But I don't know. I mean, I'll just be very frank. I don't take that seriously, these soft reform, because I don't think they work. I don't think they've worked for us. I don't think they. I mean, I guess there could be a Manchurian candidate kind of situation, but like, even if there were a Manchurian, so A, I don't know. I mean, I don't think the people on Taiwan want to be part of China, right? So I'm just looking at the polling. And then B, even if there were kind of a Manchurian candidate, like, how would that person operationalize surrender? Like, the kill mechanism for China will have to be an invasion. Now, you could worry about the that president or what have you, not ordering the forces out in time or whatever. But the kill mechanism is still the same for China. It's still the application of military force. So I don't know. I mean, I just and I think we don't have any time or the luxury of not focusing on the hard military. I don't know. I just
no, Brett. I mean, I think that's a fair explanation of your thinking on this matter. I mean, in some ways, though, I mean, the function of resiliency in the Taiwan context also, according to survey that's been done, is a function of also perceived, support, right? I mean, from internationally and in particular the United States, and so. Part of what goes towards, enhancing Taiwan's resolve is also the perception of U.S. support for its defense as well. And I wanted, to get you to talk a little bit more in terms of your thinking now. I mean, there's been a great deal more debate, in the last few years with regards to, U.S. Needing to shift to strategic clarity, in providing an explicit commitment to, Taiwan's defense. Moving away from strategic ambiguity, which essentially the dual deterrence strategy, and I think maybe I'll give you an opportunity here to sort of to refresh your strategy on this and your thinking on this matter, in the context of this strategy of denial. How does that political element factor into your theory?
So a couple things. On the strategic ambiguity, strategic clarity thing, I actually think we're in a pretty good place. I think China thinks that we would come to Taiwan's defense. I mean, that's what they seem to be signaling. I mean, I think Eli Ratner's comments a month or two ago were, we're in a pretty good place. Like, I don't want to over reassure Taiwan. I'll get to that in a second. And I want Beijing, though, to understand that we are going to be there in a way that doesn't. It's not a kind of like a throwing the glove down, challenge you to a duel sort of situation with China, because we don't actually want to provoke the dragon right now when we're in a position of weak. So I think we focus less on rhetoric, the declaratory policy, and more on making sure we can actually do it, because that's the real question. Because if we can't do it at a reasonable level of cost and risk, then we're going to pull a perimeter back and Taiwan's going to be in trouble, or we should. On the political result, look, Russell, I don't know, man. I can't believe Taiwan spends so little on defense. It's obscene. I mean, if I were Taiwanese, I would want to spend 10%. I mean, I wouldn't want to live under Xi Jinping. I mean, I was asking some Taiwanese friends a little while ago. When as a kid, I grew up in Hong Kong, and a lot of the Hong Kong Chinese had like a Canadian passport too, or something like that. And because they thought, well, I don't know what's going to happen after 1997, and it was like, okay, that makes sense. And they were right ultimately.
Yeah.
But like I actually asked them, Taiwanese friends, it's like, do you have another passport? Do you know something that I don't think? Because like right now you're sort of, oh yeah, it's very difficult bureaucratically to do these things, as if Taiwan is not like in a Britain 1940 situation. So to me, I think maybe my style is too blunt, but I think there's too much reassurance going on, and then there's a difference. There's too much reassurance on one side, and then there's too much toughness on the other, which is the kind of obviously the Chaz Freeman sort of crowd, which is not where I am. I want Taiwan to survive as a free society, not for that's not my primary goal, but our goals are aligned, right? But if I were Taiwanese, I would be like, Elbridge Colby should say more tough things to Taiwanese establishment because they're not doing their job. And I think we should be using, negative, like tough leverage on Taiwan. I would say if Taiwan comes back with some, or cuts its defense budget or asks for some dumb system, we should like put tariffs on Taiwan. Why are we? Because Americans are going to die if Taiwan continues in this direction. So I'm actually if you actually think there might be a war and you think the Americans are going to come to Taiwan's aid, you act like me if you're an American, right? Because you're like, my job is to prevent Americans from dying and preserve our security, prosperity, and liberty. That's my job. But I am saying that we should come to Taiwan's defense. I wrote a lot about it. But you should do your part. Otherwise, it's going to be a bad situation. And so I don't that seems it's a balance between reassurance and toughness and targeted pressure, which frankly, I bet a lot of people in Taiwan would welcome. They might not admit it because it's, for nationalistic reasons, of course.
Yeah.
But,
Brett, I want to pull us back to the book a bit, right now, and we'll get into that because I think that part about Taiwan investing in the capabilities that it needs is an important discussion, one that's very current as well. And I think there's been a good deal of movements there in terms of congressional legislations and that goes to that. And I want to get your some comments from you about that. But I want to go back to your book and you mentioned this about the U.S. defense perimeter, right? And I want to get your your statement here right now in terms of where you see Taiwan fitting into the U.S. current defense perimeter. Is it within that defense perimeter or is it out? I mean,
I think it should be in. I think it basically is in at this point. I mean, 5 years ago I was more worried about it, but now I think it's you've got major Department of Defense officials saying Taiwan all the time. So I think it's there. The question is whether we can keep it there now, given the PLA buildup. But the alternatives to Taiwan are bad. It's not like there's some large archipelago in the Western Pacific that we can use our Navy and Air Force to defend that wants to be part of an anti-hegemonic coalition. Indonesia's they're not banging on our door. So if we lost Taiwan and we had to compensate, our alternatives would be bad. Like what, Vietnam? I mean, we don't want to get in a land war in Asia again. That's a bad experience. So we want to keep our perimeter, if possible, at sea, basically. It's kind of simple, but we're basically kind of a sea and air power. I mean, the PLA fought the American army to a standstill when it was a far cry from the current PLA on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, it was a long time ago, but we don't want to get in that situation again if we can avoid it.
Brett, you also referenced the role of allies and partner countries, and I want you to sort of expand a bit on that. In particular, looking at Japan, India, Australia, and in that grouping of Quad, where do you see them fitting in this sort of strategy denial and in the Taiwan scenario specifically?
So, my view of our alliance network is we need to work with countries where their interests are concrete and genuine. So I'm not in favor of this sort of, I call it like the Biden administration seems to have a kind of a three musketeers attitude towards our alliances, all for one for all, that if you're a democracy, you're on our side and you'll be on our side wherever things happen. I don't think that's how the world works. I think that countries have concrete interests, which they tend to pursue. Look at Germany and France. And you need to work and make the best of that reality. So I tend towards what I think of as a division of labor model outside of the Western Pacific. So I wrote in the Indian press, and I did an event with India yesterday, and we were talking exactly about this, that I think we should basically reduce our military footprint, or kind of not. South Asia is a little different, but basically take a backseat to the Indians and be in a kind of supporting role, help them, whatever. But we don't want to try to get the Indians to involved in a Taiwan scenario. Like they're not directly interested enough. Their military is not shaped for that capacity. They're going to have their hands full dealing with the PLA in the north, not to mention the Pakistanis. So, same basically with the Europeans. The two countries that can make a difference to a Taiwan scenario, basically, other than the United States and Taiwan itself, are Japan and Australia. Australia is, in my view, is the best ally the United States has. It should be a model, probably along with like Poland. But Australia, in terms of the level of defense spending, is high relative to other allies, and they are shaping their military for collective defense. It's not for direct defense of Australia's territory. They recognize that the best strategy for us is to defend forward in the Western Pacific. I mean, if China gets to Australia, the game is already over for Australia. So that's what we want. Japan, much richer, larger economy, proximate geography, increasingly clear its political stakes in Taiwan, absolutely needs to change its way of behaving and the level of defense spending and what it's prepared to do. You see, there has been very positive movement over the last year and a half or so. That needs to be dramatically accelerated. It's a complete it's ridiculous that Japan is spending 1% of its GDP on defense. It is an absurd position. And when I tell the Japanese, our alliance is in crisis so long as Japan is spending 1% on it, because China is not spending 1%. China is a much larger economy than Japan. And, sometimes people mention the war, which is ridiculous. The war happened 75 years ago. This is for the defense of Japan. Taiwan wants Japanese help, So don't mention the war. It's like insulting almost. But so I think that's where we see Korea is going to have its hands full defending itself, not only against North Korea, but the potential for a direct Chinese assault. I mean, I'm trying to make the point to Korean partners that the military capacity to invade Taiwan is directly applicable to South Korea, which is also 100 miles off the Chinese coast. So, I mean, yes, I guess most of the military capacity for an amphibious invasion that China has developed is probably clustered in the southern part of China, but you can move things, ships, planes, men, so South Korea is going to have its hands full, and Vietnam, same. Vietnam's going to have its hands full. So, and Philippines, there's just limits on what they can do. They got to focus on themselves. So that's basically how I look. I don't think that's going to be in the Quad context. That's going to be in an alliance context.
Right.
There may be more of a trilateralization among the United States, Japan, and Australia. You see the Japanese and the Australians coming together. So that's positive, but it's more about we got to get the big stick element right.
Okay, well, Richard, let's drill in on the Taiwan contingency here, and then the Taiwan scenario, and which you focus a great deal on, and so you seem to make the argument in your book that you think a limited war over Taiwan is the most likely scenario. Why? Why is a limited war the most likely scenario?
Well, look, I mean, people criticize me on this limited war thing, which I think is kind of, I mean, it's like I don't want a limited war, obviously, but I mean, you have two superpowers with survivable nuclear arsenals, so we can both destroy each other as functioning societies, basically. But of course, you don't want to, right? So you want the other side to think you might be willing to do that for bargaining leverage. But you wouldn't actually do that. I mean, because whatever interest China has in Taiwan is certainly less than being turned into radioactive rubble, right? I mean, so, okay. And by the way, both sides plan for limited wars. I mean, Xi Jinping literally said the other day, I want you to prepare for an actual war, or a couple of weeks ago. They talk about what is it called? Localized wars under informationalized conditions or something. I forget the exact terminology, but I mean, the conventional war and with the possibility of nuclear escalation, which could be significant. So when I say limited war, I'm not talking about like the Balkans. I'm talking about a very large war that a lot of people could die, but that isn't a total war. It isn't all in with everything you have whenever you can put it in. And I think this is what we need to plan for, because it's also China's best strategy. China wants to get the gains without blowing itself up, right? And it's not credible for us to say that we're going to respond to a limited war strategy with a total war strategy. A, because it's stupid, and B, because it's not credible. They can see that we're not going to respond to, a Chinese move on Taiwan by launching a major nuclear strike, because we get it right back at us. So this is different than the 1950s. Speaking of Kimoy and Matsu, the offshore islands crises of the 50s, that was a different world because the U.S. had not a nuclear monopoly, but had dramatic nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union, let alone China. So even as late as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States could have destroyed the Soviet Union with relatively limited damage to itself. So it was much more credible for the U.S. to have that strategy. But that was a long time ago. That's not how it's just not that way anymore. And certainly with Chinese nuclear buildup, it becomes even less credible.
Well, your analysis throughout this conversation and also throughout your book emphasizes that there are variabilities in terms of a country's defensibility, and you seem to think is Taiwan defensible now, and could there become a point where you think Taiwan could become indefensible in your view?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. Taiwan is defensible. I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about a year ago because I've been hearing Graham Allison. I like Graham a lot, I respect him a lot. Graham saying, "Oh, we're losing all these war games," and I was like, "Well, you're missing the point, which is that those war games are showing how we can actually win. This is doable, but we need to do things differently, and Taiwan really needs to do things differently." So what I want to communicate to our Taiwan listeners is your fate is in your hands. I think the Americans are changing. I'm trying. I'm doing my best here in America. There are others who are fighting the fight politically. But if Taiwan doesn't pull its weight, I think it will become indefensible. And indefensible, again, is a relative standard, right? Because it's indefensible is a standard for us, basically, which is it would be too costly and risky for us to defend Taiwan to the standard it needs to keep going, right? And again, it's that relative standard. And that cost and risk, that could be direct, like just too many people are going to die. Again, God forbid, but that's how we have to think about it. Or that we will lose too much of our force and then vitiate our ability to defend our other allies. I mean, Japan is more important than Taiwan, right? So if we lose everything over Taiwan, and then Japan is totally vulnerable, we're smoked, we're toast. So we can't do that. Mm-hmm. That again, Russell, is a critical thing. Like, and that gets down to real military hardware kinds of things. Is like, if Taiwan can put sea mines out and anti-ship missiles and air defense systems, and the United States doesn't have to put so many of its forces directly into the wood chipper of the Chinese military, that makes it a lot more likely we will come to Taiwan's defense. Mm-hmm. So it's actually, I know there's this idea that like, I saw an article, it was a thoughtful article in War on the Rocks a couple of weeks ago that was like, well, Taiwan's not certain about whether America will come to its aid, so it has to hedge. But it's like Taiwan is cannot defend itself against China without America. So I think it doesn't make any sense to even hedge for that. So its defense strategy should be, if I were Taiwanese, I'd be like, our defense strategy should make it as easy as possible for the Americans to come to our effective defense. And then it links up with what I'm arguing. And then it creates like, and then Americans like me can say, hey, the Taiwans are doing their part. Look at what they're doing. We don't need to like destroy our entire force just to help Taiwan defend itself. That makes that has like a virtuous cycle effect.
I think that's something that's entirely related to this this sort of seeming disconnect is that, I think that there is obviously a sense of urgency of why Taiwan needs to focus on its defense on against the overwhelming threat that it faces from the PLA, but there's always a question of immediacy of whether or not that what is the sort of the timeline for China and what it would do to invade Taiwan, and I wonder whether or not you can comment a little bit your thoughts in terms of the immediacy of the threat. I mean, Admiral Phil Davidson had famously now, given us the now 5-year window, right? I mean, it was 6 years when he stated it, but it's 5 years now to 2027.
Time goes by.
Right, and so what for you in terms of Bridge? What is your sort of sense in terms of the immediacy of the threat facing Taiwan?
I think it's very real. I mean, I think because, and I don't pretend to know how Zhou Enlai or Xi Jinping makes decisions. But I think people who confidently assert that China will do or won't do one thing or another, I just don't find that very credible, because who knows? What I can say is I can look at the factors that are ascertainable and try to make a judgment based on that. And I say, we know China wants Taiwan, obviously. We know China has the capability, is increasingly, at least in the window of capability. Taiwan's own defense minister said they could do it now. And there are very serious people like Oriana Mastro saying the Chinese think that they have the capability. Okay, so those two things, but then you could say, well, maybe they'd be better off waiting. Okay, sure. But there are some serious reasons why I would be thinking of doing it sooner rather than later if I were Chinese. And I don't give a ton of credence to the idea that the Chinese economy is about to collapse. Over time they may run into challenges, but China seems to be, it's kind of got a lot of growth left in it. What I do see is that the Americans are finally kind of, we have started to move and focus on China. Our military investments started to change a while ago, but they take a while to come into the force. Taiwan is waking up. Japan is waking up, Australia is shifting, India is shifting. So you see this coalition coming together, and you see military investments moving more towards Asia. It's too slowly, in my view. But if you're China and you have the ability to do it now, and you think it might be harder or impossible in 5 years, maybe you do it now. And then you get Taiwan, and you kind of put to go back to that earlier thing, you put a real knife thrust into the heart of this anti-hegemonic coalition. And so, and then you could also mention other factors. I mean, if the Kremlin, Putin goes into Ukraine and we get distracted, that increases the appeal. So I think it's very real. I have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, I don't make a prediction because I don't know, but I can tell you the factors mean a very real danger.
Thanks, Rich, for that. So I do want to turn to our audience questions, and just as a reminder for our audience members that you may submit your questions via email at contact@Global Taiwan, or you can use the chat function on the YouTube page, or you can tweet us at Global Taiwan. Please remember to include your name as well as affiliation, with your questions. Those that do will be prioritized in our line of questioning. For Bridge. So, Bridge, so one of the questions that we have, the question relates actually to the final point that you just made with regards to Putin. And it says here, to what extent does Russia and China's growing alignment and partnership affect the strategy of denial?
Well, I mean, I would say I accounted for it. I wasn't expecting Russia to be in a different, much different position in the book. I mean, I'll say it makes Taiwan's situation a lot worse because, if Russia and China are working together and Russia creates problems for the United States and distracts the United States and Europe, and I'm against us doing more in Europe because of Taiwan. In fact, I've got a piece coming out later this week on this point. But I'm not the president, so like that reality is there. That makes the situation in Taiwan all the more urgent. But the logic is the same. The key is that the Europeans can largely defend themselves. I mean, we can help with kind of high-end stuff and globally deployable kind of fungible things. But we gotta. I mean, the last thing we should be doing right now is reassuring the Europeans that we're always going to be there, in the way that we have been. We need to be making it very clear to the Europeans that Taiwan is our priority, and we're behind, and they need to step up, and that's what I've been saying to the Europeans. So, but that's not what the administration seems to be doing, unfortunately, which just actually makes the situation in Taiwan even worse. So it's pretty bad.
Next question is, if you were in China's position, how would you try to counter the strategy of denial?
Excellent question. Okay. Right. So strategy is an interactive engagement. This is kind of what I'm thinking. I think my impression is that where things are evolving is that China may determine. So I think the localized war that makes the war over Taiwan seem as disconnected from Americans' interests as possible is China's best strategy. But if China can't achieve that, what's its second best strategy? Well, its second best strategy might be something more like what the Japanese did, not necessarily with all the territorial acquisition, but a larger war designed to achieve a kind of fait accompli at the regional level. And because China is so much bigger than Japan was. I mean, remember, Japan was like 10% of the U.S. economy. China's 100% of the U.S. economy, and has the largest shipbuilding industry in the world, et cetera, and has the advantage of proximity. Then I think I might go to the big war, the big limited war, that's designed to really knock the Americans out in a decisive defeat, and I wouldn't worry so much about limiting the war around Taiwan. I might go for decisive battles. That would probably lead me to wait a little bit longer until I could get, my carriers could get their sea legs and my submarines and my long-range bombers. And although these are all in the force now or coming into the force, but I'd want to kind of kick the dust or whatever, kick the legs or whatever. But I think if I were going to go for it and I was trying to, that's how I would respond. The other way, which would be also tough, would be to try to go back to hide and bide
Mm.
because I think they came out of the gate too early. They got arrogant after the financial crisis and under Xi Jinping. I'm not sure that's going to work because I don't think anybody's going to believe them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that leads me to think that the big war, and I mean, we have a pretty fragile chin. I mean, we've been talking about the vulnerability of our bases in the Western Pacific for 10 years, but have done relatively little about it, which is why the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is so important and gets so much attention. But I think that's what I would
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm. Next question. Besides increasing the defense budget, and I would just add maybe investing in certain capability. What recommendations would you make for the Taiwanese government to enhance their defense? Should there be
Yeah.
changes to Taiwan's conscription policy, and how so? Could it be changed to enhance Taiwan's
Well, from what I can
defensibility?
tell, Admiral Lee's overall defense concept was pretty, and I know it's controversial in Taiwan among some, but I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm not an expert on military operations or let alone Taiwanese military operations. But I think focus on the problem, and the problem is defeating the invasion to enable American effort. So sinking ships or degrading ships, you don't have to kill the ship if you can wound the ship or slow it down or divert it. Those are all good, and if you're dug in and you're resilient against the forces that do land on the island, because almost certainly some forces with China PLA would get there. I think those are all, conscription. I don't know. I know it's a hot button issue. I mean, it seems to me, I'm skeptical of insurgency arguments for Taiwan's defense. I think once the PLA secured control, they're very good at, putting these down, and they're ruthless. So, in the Philippines in the 1940s, there was a Philippine insurgency, but it didn't really make a difference. So I think what we don't want to get to that point. So I think it's about degrading and diverting and weakening the invasion both by air and sea. And then I would say stockpiling and making the east coast of the island more accessible, it seems to me, right? Like in a blockade scenario, and presumably an invasion, especially if we were able to frustrate an invasion, it would also include a blockade, right? And a bombardment kind of. So the more that Taiwan has available, that it's not, hanging on by a thread for U.S. I mean, this is yet another example, right? If Taiwan survives only by every American ship and airplane getting through, that's going to be hard, Whereas if Taiwan is, the Americans can afford to come in only at the best time and the right kind of platform, and we take less attrition, more likely to be successful and for the Americans to follow through. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Okay. I do want to get back to the, earlier when we had said about the, the capabilities that Taiwan needs to invest in. And I wanted to get to this because, a member of Congress, Congressman Mike Gallagher, Republican in Wisconsin, had recently penned this article in the Foreign Affairs that was focused, on, Taiwan, specifically looking at Taiwan can't wait. And in it deals with the issue of, foreign military financing, and he had proposed, and along with, several other members have, put forward proposals for foreign military financing to Taiwan, with ranges from like, 2 billion to 3 billion, and he proposes, 3 billion annually in military financing. Can you sort of speak to us about, really what you see as the sort of the value of these types of this offer? This would be a sort of a new, if it is implemented, would provide a new avenue of defense and security cooperating. What are what in your view are the sort of the strong or downsides to such an offer?
Well, I think the bill that he and Senator Hawley put out is exactly the kind of right approach, which is, as I understand it, is a kind of a conditional offer for greater assistance. That it's like, if Taiwan increases defense spending, we will do more. If Taiwan buys the right stuff, we will do more. We will take more risk, and we're serious about it. So I think that's the right approach. I mean, I think the days of selling Abrams tanks and stuff should be over. Maybe the Abrams tanks works here and there. I don't know, but like, the Apache helicopter or whatever. We should be selling things that, because those are going to be, Americans are going to die more whether Taiwan does that. So I think, and if we're saying we will, and I think Taiwan will be much more likely to have greater assistance if it's seen as doing the things that are necessary for an integrated defense effectively. And I think I think to earlier point, I mean, I can't remember if it's mentioned in that bill, which I hope passes, but it's we should be willing to do more with the Taiwan military, but it's really about increasing Taiwan's military capability, and quietly improving capacity, to fight the Chinese and fight together, and not worry. I don't like if Kiribati switches recognition. I don't think that's something that we should. I think we should respond to every Chinese provocation on Taiwan by increasing the military capacity of Taiwan's defense, not responding symmetrically. Because that's where as we discussed, that's where the danger is.
Well, I mean, you've been really generous with your time with us, and I think really in our conversation today, you really laid out a clear framework for what U.S. goals and interests are, and really a clear strategy for how to defend Taiwan. And so, thank you again for your time. I apologize to our audience members whose questions I was unable to get to today. But nevertheless, I'm sure we'll stay engaged on this very important issue. So thank you again, Bridge, and good luck with your efforts to promote your book. Again, The Strategy of Denial: American Defense in the Age of Great Power Conflict. So make sure to purchase.
Thank you, Russell. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. Great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.